My sophomore year, or I should say my freshman year of high school, I walked through the doors as about a 5'1", little kind of pipsqueak, and it was just kind of an easy source of being like made fun of by kids, and not just like kids, not even from those that I was in high school with that I didn't know very well. It was actually my three best friends. So the three guys that I would always hang out with were kind of my worst enemies in a certain sense, because I would say a word and they would somehow negatively reinforce what I said, my freshman year of high school was pretty, I don't think it's too traumatic, lots of moments of despair, lots of moments of anxiety and stress in the midst of this, because I didn't have the capacity to make new friends. You know what I mean? Like, I'd been kind of beaten down and had such a lack of confidence from all these like experiences with my three closest friends. It was like, I can't actually make new friends in a certain sense. I was the kid that sat in the back of class, and you as a teacher would say, oh, something, I'd say two words back. Just had zero confidence in speaking to people, whether they be teachers or, again, kind of that situation of making new friends. Kind of fast forward a little bit, those in the midst of that, my relationship with God was pretty strained. I would say it was kind of like again, not to be too dramatic, but borderline suicidal agnostic. You know what I mean? Like, really, I see things pretty black and white. And it was like, we are either a wonder beyond all telling, or we're just a bunch of neurons shooting off in our body, and we're all going to die, and that's it, right? And in my mind, it was like intellectually like those two things. And so towards the tail end of my freshman year, I got a job. In this place that I was working at, there were three guys in particular that were part of the youth ministry down the street, and it was the parish I, quote, grew up at that I never went to, right? These three guys, they just loved me. We would play, like, we'd do antics, just the best job in the world. Always kind of hanging out, would go out to lunch, that sort of thing. And they loved me. And what was so profound about it was I was still that awkward kid that wouldn't say anything, and they didn't care. They kind of pushed through that and were able to like really love me profoundly. That I experienced God kind of in community in particular. So much so that I started to become open to the idea that, oh, God is real and He is for me. I remember one night in particular, I was driving home after hanging out with actually some other kind of friends. And I was driving home, and I decided to stop by the Catholic parish and go to our adoration chapel. Right? Never in a million years would do this. This is not my thing. At this point, I walk in, and it's a chapel of like 10 people. There were two ladies there. Knowing what I was wearing at the time, they probably thought I was going to like steal something. Just like walking through. I ended up staying for about 30 minutes, so then it was like stealing something. Now he's going to be a priest. It was like the threshold changed pretty quick. And I remember going into that adoration chapel and sitting and praying. And again, I've never really done this before. I kind of grew up Catholic, grew up in the church, going for school. I knew the Our Father, the Hail Mary, those sorts of things. I'd probably done prayers of petition before at this point, just like, God, take care of my family, that kind of thing. What changed wasn't what I prayed, it was how I prayed. I actually prayed from my heart for the first time. And I can remember not necessarily like, there weren't fireworks going off. There weren't even like huge tears going down my eyes, but all of a sudden I realized that God is for me. Right? And I can be in relationship with Him. And kind of from that place, I should be doing a million other things other than doing even what I'm doing right now. One of the things that's just to say, this was 20 years ago or so, I was a kid in the back of the class that could only say two words, look at what I'm doing right now. You know what I mean? Just like, and that's not because I'm some great person, that's just because God actually is who He says He is, and He transforms us, right? If we allow Him to. And so even as somebody in the church, my friends, we cannot lose our own relationship with God for the sake of working at a parish or the diocese. You know what I mean? Like, at the end of the day, we need to be seeking Him out, continuing to like re-engage Him. And I think even in the midst of like the wake of the pandemic, it's like continue to go to Him, with all of your thoughts, your concerns, your hopes, your dreams, your worries. he wants to continue to meet us in that place of Galilee, right? That we can be taken back there in a certain sense and hold on to that consolation and let it inform the things that we do. Obviously, what we've been talking about this morning, or perhaps haven't been talking that much about, is mission-driven catechesis, right, in a certain sense, right? I've been talking about all the intricacies of catechesis. We'll get there. It'll be fun. It'll be nerdy. I can't wait. But so much of it has to be from this relationship with Christ, this encounter with him that, in a certain sense, overflows into what it is that we do every single day, right? The emails that we write, the interactions we have with our coworkers, certainly the lessons we prepare and the teen events that we do, or whatever it is that you do specifically, it's like that has to come from a place of really encountering the deep, profound love of Jesus Christ. Because if not, what are we doing? What do we miss? Like, there's such a, we're kind of robbed of its dynamism, we're robbed of its grace in a very real way if we're not continuing to seek him. I'd like you to look at, back to the beginning, Galilee moments. On this page, there's these 3 bullet points I just want to really highlight as we begin our time. This is from Pope Benedict XVI. He says, being a Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or lofty idea, but the encounter with an event, a person, which gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction. Those are some pretty beautiful words. Jesus Christ says that I am the way, the truth, and the life, right? Buddha says, be a light unto yourself. Jesus says, I am the light of the world. Jesus points to himself, right? If Jesus is who he says he is, that is a really, really big deal. We have the opportunity to encounter him because of the resurrection. We get to be witnesses of the resurrection, as it says in Acts, right? That we can encounter the risen Jesus, right? He's not just a moral code, right? That's not just what we're following, right? There's morality certainly within the church, but it's not a moral code. It's not a philosophical principle. It's not all of these things. It's really an encounter with him. The Directory for Catechesis says, the encounter with Christ involves the person in his totality, heart, mind, senses. It does not concern only the mind, but also the body, and above all, the heart. Not just knowing a lot about someone, but actually coming to know them. Right? This ought to, in a certain sense, inform what it is that we do, I believe. Right? Pope Paul VI in Evangelion, this is the one from 1975 I mentioned before. He says, modern man listens more willingly to witnesses than teachers. And if he does listen to teachers, it is because they are witnesses, right? Because they have witnessed the resurrection, right? And they embody it. Think about your favorite teacher that you've ever had, grade school, high school, college, whoever it might have been. You probably don't remember anything they said. Very little of what they said, but you remember how they made you feel, right? The person that they are, and there was something, I want to be like that person, right? As a catechist, as a catechetical leader in our church, this, in a certain sense, is what you signed up for, right? Is to embody someone who follows Jesus without abandonment, right? That follows Jesus wherever he goes. That this ought to be what we are leading with, right? This next quote I just really love. You may be the only gospel they will ever read, right? Even if they come to our churches, it doesn't mean they're picking up a Bible at some point, right? Maybe they hear it from Mass, that kind of thing. But to really think about that, like your personal witness, who you are, hear me right when I say this. We need to be joyful, humble, seeking Jesus in all that we are. We cannot be crabby, right? I work for an Archdiocese. It's really easy for me to be crabby, right? You can put me on record as saying that. Like, there's some days where it's like, I kind of want to hit my head against the wall, right? This passive agreement email here, or this, like, even just in different work, it's just like, yeah, there's work relationships that are difficult. There's certain situations, there's certain parents that are just a pain in the butt, right? There's certain teens where you're like, goodness gracious, like, are you ever going to get on the right track? You know what I mean? There's so many different situations that we're placed in where it's not the ideal, right? And we have every reason to not be hopeful and not be joyful. And that, my friends, is where we need to be joyful and hopeful all the more, is in the midst of that. Because that's actually what translates the love of Jesus Christ to the next generation. I'll never forget this. When I was, my first job out of college was actually working for a Catholic high school. I was a campus minister, so essentially a youth minister, but for a school instead of a parish. And after a couple of years living in Denver, which was awesome, by the way, I lived right down the street from the original Chipotle. It was amazing. It's a little bit spicier than all the other Chipotles. Just phenomenal. Got to go in the mountains. Just had like a really great time, but I wanted to move back to the Midwest, so I ended up leaving. And there was this girl who was kind of the socially awkward girl of the school, you know, that came up to me on my last day. And she came up to me and she was kind of like crying or whatnot. And this was after a couple of years of being there. And I knew her, but she wasn't the easy one. You know what I mean? There's certain people that you connect with like real naturally. She was the difficult one, even for me as like the teacher or one of the authorities, not just you know, the students alone. And she said, "Mr. Burds, you always smiled at me." Here I was thinking she was like crying, like, "Thanks for that talk," or "Thanks for that retreat," or "Thanks for that lesson or Bible study." It's like, no, you always smiled at me and said hi to me. That's like what she said. It's like, that's it. You know what I mean? Like, it is that other stuff, 100%. But if we're missing that moment, if we're so consumed in our program that we miss the person in front of us, that's the problem, right? We need to be convicted in loving people, right? Because Jesus was a person. So when we become more like Jesus, we become Jesus to those people, right? And this isn't just like a lofty thought, right? This is actually like Catholic teaching, right? Is we ought to live Jesus and interact with other people as though Jesus was us, right? Again, discipleship, living as Jesus would if he were you. That's, in a certain sense, what's at stake in every interaction that we have. I don't toss that out there to be scary or like, ooh, you know, like there's a weightiness to it, but that's a weightiness to the call that you've entered into, right? That I've entered into. Just super important. All right. Okay. Wonderful. I got a chance to talk about Galilee. Love it. Love it. Okay. This next part. So my son Frankie, who you saw, he's almost 4. When he was 2 years old, it was the summertime. And my wife and I were celebrating our 5th anniversary. Awesome. Really exciting. We go to Mass that day at our parish. And we go to an older parish that has statues up front with like candles and all that. And brought our son with it. We went to Our Lady, right? We go up there, and a bit of a backstory is Frankie's been carrying around Lightning McQueen. If you don't know, Lightning McQueen is, he's from the movie Cars. It's a Disney movie. He's never seen Cars, but this car was super cool to him for whatever reason. He called it Beep Beep because that's all he could like get out was Beep Beep, right? That was his car. Right? And so he brought this thing absolutely everywhere. There was moments where he woke up in the middle of the night screaming, "Beep, beep, 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 beep," right? I'm trying to find it, looking all throughout the house. I remember he left it outside, so I was outside with my phone, like trying, like with a flashlight, trying to find the stupid thing so he'd go back to bed. You know, like he is just kind of obsessed with Beep, beep. We kneel before Our Lady. He's got Beep, beep in his hand and chucks it into the cash box. You know what I mean? And it was gone. Like, what were we gonna do? You know what I mean? We were about to go on this big trip kind of thing to celebrate our anniversary, and he just chucked like the thing into Beep Beep, right? Or excuse me, into the cash box. And we were talking with my mother-in-law later that day, kind of joking about it, what are we gonna do, all of that. And she goes, "Well, I'm glad that he was able to give Our Lady all that he had." You know, and you know, just think of it, it's kind of goofy, but in a certain sense, what is your Beep Beep? You know, and again, it's kind of a goofy illustration, but it was just like a really beautiful moment, right? Is like, let's actually chuck that in and offer it to the Lord, right? And is that not discipleship, right? Whatever it is that we're holding on to, that perhaps net, you know, that the disciples were holding on to, that they let go of, at some point we need to make a decision to chuck it into the cash box and give it to Our Lady, right? Give it to Jesus, right? That there's this moment of decision that needs to take place. And perhaps it's taken place a number of times throughout your life, or like one major time, you know, like one kind of 180 moment. But this is what the church would describe as conversion, right? Where all of a sudden there's kind of a reorientation of life. Perhaps we had some kind of beep that we were always holding on to, and then we decided to let it go, right? And that actually was an encounter with Christ. Perhaps this like Galilee moment that we were talking about before was kind of a major moment of decision for you, but at some point we have to make a decision. And I would say in another way is that that's also a decision that we have to invite other people into. When you look, if you look at the second bullet point down here, this kind of deciding to drop our nets, John Paul II, beautiful quote, "Conversion means accepting by a personal decision the saving sovereignty of Christ and becoming his disciple." So the way that John Paul II is using the word conversion is different than oftentimes how we hear it. When we think conversion as Catholics, oftentimes we think of like somebody who is an evangelical that became Catholic, or somebody that was a Baptist that became Catholic, right? He's talking about something very different here. Conversion means accepting by a personal decision the saving sovereignty of Christ and becoming his disciple, that Jesus is my Savior, right? We hear that and we think, oh, that's an evangelical kind of concept, right? Jesus is my Lord and Savior. Here, John Paul II is putting it in an ecclesial document, right? Is that this means conversion, that I am deciding to follow Jesus wherever he goes, right? Just like the apostles dropped their nets, right? And they begin to follow Jesus. They're covered in the dust of the Master. All of those pieces. This is what, in a certain sense, we need to, especially in evangelization, be proclaiming Christ in such a way that we invite people to make this sort of decision, right? And so I'd almost ask, as you like kind of formulate the different things that you do, are you inviting people to make a decision to follow Jesus in the things that you're doing, right? Teaching, yes. Doing a variety of different methods, different activities, all of that, but are you inviting people to follow Jesus? If you look at the very, 2 bullet points down, this is also from John Paul II, conversion, or metanoia, right, it's the Greek word that's used, to which every person is called, leads to an acceptance and appropriation of the new vision which the gospel proposes. This requires leaving behind our worldly way of thinking and acting, which so often heavily conditions our behavior. As sacred scripture reminds us, the old man must die and the new man must be born. That is, the whole person must be renewed in full knowledge after the image of the Creator. This leaving behind of worldly things. You know this because you probably experienced it at different points. I can remember in high school, like I was super into kind of this like jam band scene and like this whole like culture kind of way of living. And all of a sudden, after I decided to follow Jesus, I was like, I need new friends. Well, especially I needed new friends at the time. I need to think a bit more about what music I'm listening to, right? The things I'm consuming every single day, right? There was this kind of reorientation of life where it wasn't like I was just looking at Jesus on Sunday, right, for an hour, but I started to look to Jesus in every decision I made. This quote from Father Pedro Arrupe, who's a Jesuit from the early part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century. He says this: "Nothing is more practical than finding God, than falling in love in a quite absolute final way. What you're in love with, what seizes your imagination, will affect everything. It will decide what will get you out of bed in the morning, what you do with your evenings, how you spend your weekends, what you read, whom you know, what breaks your heart, and what amuses you with joy and gratitude. Fall in love, stay in love, and it will decide everything." This is the invitation for our people, right? Is, again, a life of conversion. And it's actually incredibly practical. It's very challenging, right? But it's incredibly practical. This informs everything. Not just one thing. Not just an hour a week. Not just when it's nice to talk about it, right? Or when you're with like minds, quote unquote, that it actually informs everything. It's something you've probably experienced in a whole host of different ways, whole host of different decisions throughout your life, but that's in a certain sense what we're inviting people into, is this metanoia, right? This conversion to go from one to another, one place to another, right? And so in that, the question becomes, how do we, what does that look like, right? What is that moving from kind of conversion to a place of communion take place, right? And this is where catechesis really kicks in. All right, this is from the Directory for Catechesis, the new one. Catechesis is an ecclesial act arising from the missionary mandate of the Lord, and aimed, as its very name indicates, at making the proclamation of his passion, death, and resurrection continually resound in the heart of every person, so that his life may be transformed. In this, I love that word resound in particular. Another way to kind of put it is it's an echo, right? It's an echo of what happened. Jesus' passion, his death, his resurrection, that is echoed throughout time. I mean, think about this. What are we doing here? 2,000 years, like, we are standing on the shoulders of how many giants, right? That we are in Rice Lake, Wisconsin, talking about Jesus. You know what I mean? Like, 2,000 years, like, the ripple effect over the last 2,000 year history of the church is just so incredibly profound. It's miraculous that we are here, right? That echo has been echoed on. None of us, if we were beggars showing other beggars where the food is, none of us made that food, right? That does not come from us. That's why the directory says it's an ecclesial act, right? Catechesis. It's like, this is the treasure chest. This is the place, this is the fountain of life, right, that we're always kind of drawing back to. And it has been echoed throughout the last 2,000 years, this passion, this death, this resurrection of our Lord, right? So that our lives too may be transformed. Each one of you would probably be able to articulate like a Galilee moment, right, where you've encountered the love of Jesus Christ. That's only because of catechesis, right? That people have been bringing people into the great beauty of our faith for 2,000 years, this beautiful echo, right? And that's, in a very real way, what it is we're seeking to pass on. It's not of us, it's something we've encountered that's so far greater and so bigger, so much bigger than us, right? And the hope is obviously it resounds in generations to come, right? The goal of catechesis here, to be in communion with Jesus. If you look at this next one in particular, accordingly, the definitive aim of catechesis is to put people not only in touch, but in communion, in intimacy with Jesus Christ. Only He can lead us to the love of the Father in the Spirit and make us share in the life of the Holy Trinity. Pope John Paul II, Catechese Tradendae, which is a specific document on catechesis. But think about this, the definitive aim of catechesis, everything that we're doing, right, is ultimately to bring about communion. And so in that, you can see, in all that we've talked about with evangelization, it's not in opposition of catechesis, right? They're hand in glove, right? By proclaiming Christ, introducing people to the person of Jesus Christ, helping them come to a decision point, right? Where they start to actually live this life and have this kind of reorientation of life, brings them to a place of, how do I integrate this into my daily life, right? How do I become in deeper and fuller communion with this Jesus that I encountered on this retreat, right? Or in this moment of life in particular? How do I dive deeper into that real communion, right? That communal experience? In this, you can kind of see in this, you can see a bit of the road to Emmaus in particular. We talked about the road to Emmaus a second ago. So, road to Emmaus, one of my all-time favorite scripture passages. Certainly would be one to perhaps like go to after this day today, because I think there's so much profound richness to it. But you can see in the trajectory of the two disciples that Jesus, who they don't know it's Jesus, are walking with, right? You can see so many different elements of evangelization and catechesis present. So just to kind of name a few, right? These two disciples are walking away from Jerusalem on Easter Sunday, right? They heard that Jesus had resurrected, but they, for whatever reason, did not believe, right? It's at least speculation, left Jerusalem. They're a couple miles outside the city when Jesus encounters them. So they left the place of the passion, they left the place of the death, they also left the place of the resurrection. They're walking away. Jesus comes alongside them and he says, what is it that you were talking about? He's more interested in their questions than his answers at that point. Really, really beautiful principle, I think, especially as we think about evangelization catechesis. He's more interested in their questions than his answers at that point. We can't be a church that only gives answers. We need to be a church that asks, what are your questions? The church has all the answers, right? Don't hold back that fire hose, right? Just make sure that they're able to actually receive it, right? At the end of the day. Jesus asked them this question. They obviously, in kind of a hopeless way, say, we believe that this was the Messiah, right? Are you the only one that doesn't know what happened these days, right? And Jesus beautifully does fire hose. He says, "You foolish men of heart," right, or slow of heart to believe, right, and then unpacks the Old Testament scriptures, right. He tells all the different passages that point to himself, and they're so captivated by his presence that they're actually brought to a point where when they get to Emmaus, they want him to come with them, right. They want him to draw near to them, and at table, right, he lifts up the bread, right, and that's where they recognize his presence, right, is in Mass, essentially. Right? An incredibly beautiful story, right? They're brought to communion. Jesus accompanies them. He walks with them to be able to proclaim his goodness, but also to reveal his presence in the Eucharist in particular. He brings them to communion. Here's the big kicker, though, is what do they do right after that? Their eyes are opened, and they go back to Jerusalem, back to the place that they just left, to be able to tell the apostles that they just encountered Jesus. Right? They are sent on mission from that place of communion. As Jesus draws them deeper and deeper into communion, they encounter him. What do? Is they go back. Right? This is why that moment of encounter is so incredibly profound. When you think of the shepherds, they see Jesus. They see Jesus as a baby in the Nativity, and they go and proclaim the glory of God, right? The Samaritan woman encounters Jesus and then leaves her water jar and goes and tells everybody about it, right? There's such a dynamic, and you can see it all throughout the Gospels, of people encountering Jesus and then sharing him with others. This is a really great place in Rockford, Illinois, where I'm originally from. Sorry, Illinois references. Just kidding. We always say it's a great place to be from. We love living in Milwaukee. So anyway, so there's this great place in Rockford, Illinois, that when I grew up, would go there all the time. We may or may not have skipped first hour when I was in high school to go to this place. A breakfast place called the Potato Shack. Okay, I mean the greatest greasy spoon restaurant that you could ever imagine. So same owners have owned it for like generations. Right, it's been handed down. Greek family, they closed down all of August, right? So that because everybody's kind of in the family sort of thing. And you go there, and they have 3 major meal options. You can get a number of things, but their 3 major meal options are letter A, B, and C, right? I always get letter B. It's 3 eggs over easy with bacon, toast, and hash browns, and then a cup of coffee for like $4.75. I mean, just the greatest place in the world. They're what do you call it? Table covers, or tablecloths. Probably the same. I mean, the same since I've been going there, which was 30-some years ago. I mean, this is just like the greatest place in the world. Most likely, if you ever go to Rockford, Illinois, you would be more likely to go to the Potato Shack now that you've just heard this little goofy story, right? It's just the best place in the world. Why? Is because I have encountered Potato Shack, right? And now I'm telling you about it because it's awesome. We do this all the flipping time, right? Why don't we do this with our faith, right? I know you do in a certain sense, right? By working for the church, people expect it from you. You're kind of like the owner of Potato Shack in a certain sense, right? But especially thinking of like your volunteers, your key leaders, people that you can like pull in on, how can you help them in a certain sense come to a greater communion with Jesus, because that's what leads to mission, right? John Paul II talks about this, is that by entering deeper into communion with him, only mission is going to come about. And the beautiful part about mission coming about is that leads to even greater communion, in a sense. I mean, one thing that I'm just so convicted of is the lack of missionary initiative in our church today. The lack of evangelizing that's actually taking place, I think, is actually because of our lack of encountering Jesus. Because it's a biblical thing. You look through the Gospels, people encounter Jesus, they evangelize. It's probably the main reason that the new evangelization, in a sense, hasn't really taken root, in my opinion, in a lot of ways, is that we are not a people that are encountering Jesus, that are coming to a deeper place of conversion within our own lives. Because that's how we be Jesus to the world, right? That's how we share Christ's love to the world, right? And in this, again, kind of going back to Pope John Paul II, right? Always a good place to go back to. The definitive aim of catechesis is to put people not only in touch, but in communion, right? If you're the owner of Potato Shack, how can you invite everybody into the restaurant and let them not just like be a kind of one and done sort of person, but they're sitting up at like the bar. You know what I mean? You know those people that just like, you go into a greasy spoon restaurant and they've got their paper out and they've got a cup of coffee, maybe a cigarette. I guess you can't do that in buildings anymore. Anyway, they're there every single day, right? That's what we want to invite people into, right? Is the depth of communion in a certain sense. This next one from the Directory for Catechesis. Catechesis forms believers for a mission, right? As I was just saying. Accompanying them in the maturation. I love that word when we think about catechesis, right? It's maturing, right? Of attitudes of faith and making them aware that they are missionary disciples, called to participate actively in the promotion of the gospel and to make the kingdom of God present in the world. The church's closeness to Jesus is part of a common journey. Communion and mission are profoundly interconnected, as I mentioned before. So how do we actually do this, right? When you think about what happened as people encountered Jesus, think of St. Peter in particular, right? He is called from his former way of life. He has dropped his nets. He's left everything. What does Jesus do during those 3 years? He teaches him to be a disciple, right? And this isn't just a presentation with like a PowerPoint, right? That's not what Jesus is doing. What is he doing? He is sharing life with him, right? And this is challenging. I think this is something that I think is just so difficult for our day and age, even in my own work, you know, and where we're at as a church, is that people need to be able to see what the Christian life looks like. And that's really challenging when you only have them for an hour a week or an hour and a half a week kind of thing, you know. But in that, that's why your own kind of personal testimony, your own witness of faith is so incredibly profound, because you're able to make faith tangible for people, right? It's not just something that they learn about, it's something you've encountered that you can share from, right? It's both and, you know, that there's this opportunity for you to really share, this is what God has done in my life, this is what he's doing in my life, he's up to something good, let me tell you about it, right? This is, in a certain sense, what apprenticeship really is. The Vatican II document here quoted in particular talks about apprenticeship, but I want to kind of walk through this like model of apprenticeship that I have here. It's just teach, show, try, do. Really simple. There's kind of the English or literature maxim, show, don't tell, right? Don't just tell people about things, but actually show them, right? Show them what this looks like. And I think this is a really helpful way to think about things. As a model, I would argue that this is what should be in absolutely everything that we do as a church, because it's in everything that we do as a society in a lot of ways. What does a student teacher do, right? Is he or she learns from the teacher that they are entrusted to, right? During that semester before they go teach, right? Somebody who graduates from law school, are they partner right away at their law firm? Absolutely not, right? They learn as a young gun underneath somebody who knows the ropes, who's done law for a number of years, right? We have this sense of like mentorship ingrained in us as a society, and we really lack it in the church oftentimes. At least we lack intentionality with it, right? In a certain sense, like if you've been doing ministry for a number of years, there's a number of people just in this room that are just starting out. What would it look like to actually mentor? You know what I mean? Thinking of, what do you call the discipleship groups? Cenacles, right? Like other opportunities like that, you know, that bring about some great sense of like mentorship, right? You have that in the diocesan office. You have that just as peers, right? To bring some intentionality perhaps around it. I know, at least for myself, I can look at a number of different priests, a number of different people that I've worked with that have stepped into my life. And because of the uniqueness of church world, right, it's not just they showed me how to do my job well, they showed me how to live well, right? To actually live this life, what that looked like. My former boss at the diocese, Rich, he is this incredibly the way he starts off literally every presentation, because I know Rich pretty well, is he says, I've worked for the church for 41 years and I'm still smiling, you know, which I just love. So he's been in ministry for a number of years, but he's also a dad that has grown children, right, adults, he always says grown adults, but in so many different ways over the last couple of years, he's just been a mentor to me, obviously in my job, right, but also to a certain degree in just life and how to live. The joy that he has I think is just really profound. He does that with intentionality, right? When he hired me, he had the sense of like, oh, this is somebody that I could see replacing me at some point, you know? There's kind of a leadership pipeline, if you will, to a certain degree. And that's not in out with the old, in with the new mentality. I think that's just good apprenticeship, right? Is that if you have some years under you, think about maybe trying to apprentice somebody that perhaps doesn't, right? Teach a few things along the way. And I think this is just a really kind of beautiful principle to instill within, certainly within the church world, but we have to have this in our ministry. And this can be a little bit challenging because it's difficult sometimes to say, I think I know a little bit more than you. Right? That's like a difficult thing to like kind of articulate to someone, and you don't want to say it like that, certainly. But there's been some people, like a lot of my work in the last decade or so has been with young adults. And there's been a number of young adults that, are a lot smarter than me, you know, that have greater degrees and certainly get paid more, you know, that I've just sat down at a coffee shop, you know, we just having coffee or perhaps a beer, you know, if it's the right setting. And say, can I just like show you, I've been living the Catholic life for a long time, can I just show you a little bit of what this looks like, right? And it doesn't take much, but all of a sudden I'm in this person's life and can kind of speak into a number of different things, right? Because no matter their own situation, there is something that they're looking for, right? And I know this gets a little bit dicey, obviously, with people under 18 to a certain degree, you know, diocesan policies and stuff, good, right? But there's certain ways to kind of instill this, even thinking of core teams, other catechists, other volunteers. How can you kind of like instill this sense of like apprenticeship and do so with intentionality? This little process is just an easy way to think about it, right? So the first one, teach, right? The revealed content of the faith, which, although taught, does not originate in the catechist. Duh, right? Is that we're beggars showing other beggars where the food is. What happens when you actually get the person to the food, right? This is the beauty of it, right? This is the fullness of it. This next one, show. Can I just like show you how to eat it? You know what I mean? Which sounds kind of funny, but like that's what actually makes it tangible for a lot of people. They need to really see it, right? Students need to see communion with Christ lived out. A witness via your word or your life, right? Or actually showing them what is being taught. So thinking, if you're doing a lesson on the Eucharist, actually taking students to adoration, that kind of thing. So teach, show, try. At the end of the day, people need to put faith into practice. Whatever it has been taught, whatever it is that has been shown, they have to somehow like try it in some sense. The next one is to do. What is repeatedly tried with accountability gradually becomes a confident ability. I would imagine in these like discipleship groups from the diocese, a beautiful piece of this is accountability, right? That's how something takes root in anybody's life, is where there's somebody like a peer or perhaps an older kind of mentor that is showing this person, right? Helping them to really live this out, right? Where it becomes really tangible. One of my favorite kind of thoughts around discipleship in particular is this idea of really integrating faith into daily life. And you guys know how hard it is to develop a new habit, right? Super challenging. It takes time, and then you fall away at different points and that sort of thing. Like, that's kind of what we're getting at, is how can you instill that more and more into your ministry, where there's that sense of accountability, where it's not just a faith or a content that's believed, but it's truly lived out of the person, right? In the way that we're inviting them to really live the faith in a certain sense. This next little question I think is just really powerful, a great like kind of reflection question. Are we empowering those we teach to live the Christian life independently? Are we empowering those we teach to live the Christian life independently? And this is a bit of a gut check. I know it's been a gut check for me, is that it's really, it's easy to even let our ministries kind of be about us in a certain sense, about what it is that we're saying or what we're doing or how we've designed things, right? But are we really helping the people entrusted to our care live the Christian life independently? That when we go away, they're able to still live this life. Right? Kind of from the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I know, a little cheesy, sorry. We're in Wisconsin. Anyways. All right. Stephen Covey, he says the whole 7 habits are really kind of hinged on this moving from dependence to independence to interdependence. And I think this is actually a good way to think about it, helping people who have just been converted, just said, hey, I actually want to live this life. The moment of catechesis there that I think can be really beautiful is, that's awesome. Let me help you come to a place of independence where you can actually really live this on your own, independently, right? Obviously with the Lord and surrendered and things, don't take it too far. But just like that you can, in a certain sense, feed yourself. You're a beggar, showing other beggars where the food is, right? You know where the food is, right? They can find that source, right? But also to move to interdependence. Not only can I go to the food, but I want to bring other people to it, right? In a sense. Good. Okay. Let's see. I think that's probably good for this morning. I know food's coming out. How about just like questions or reflections, thoughts, from our time together this morning so far? Again, any brave souls? Go for it.
So the idea about asking or inviting somebody to make Jesus the center of life, I agree. The church is really pulled out of that. I personally really pulled out of that. Do you think, is there any way to do that in like a group or a classroom setting, or is it more relationship, one-on-one, coffee shop, or
I think that, so if you did hear the question of just like inviting someone to make a decision to follow Jesus, right? What's the right setting for that? I think it can be multiple settings, that can be on a retreat, like do you all have tech up here, or have you before, or like, a retreat that's kind of really focused on the basic gospel message. Those are just really great opportunities. It could certainly be within a larger group setting. I think where it can be especially powerful is in more of a one-on-one setting, or a perhaps like group of 2 or 3, sort of setting. So one thing that we do in the Archdiocese is we're kind of promoting what we call just discipleship groups. They're groups of 3 or 4 people that we're implementing at the parish level. And the idea here is that we meet over a specific amount of time, always like kind of going through scripture, but there's all these like decision points in a certain sense that are inviting people to, okay, we've learned this, now actually like apply it, right? Or we've talked about this and we've talked about the change that we want to see take place. What does that really look like, right? You want to start praying every day. Well, where are you going to pray? When are you going to pray? What does that actually look like, right? And kind of get a sense of that. So I think kind of back to your question, perhaps a little bit, a smaller setting can sometimes be a bit more powerful, especially because there's more of an opportunity for you to be able to speak into their life. You know what I mean? To invite. Where in a larger group setting, perhaps that can almost be a little bit difficult, but I've seen it really powerful in both settings, or like a large conference kind of setting, that kind of thing. But I think oftentimes where it takes root, perhaps the best is in a smaller setting. Yeah, go for it.
This isn't as much like a logistical catechesis question as a spiritual question that I wrestle with a lot. And maybe it's because I'm more introverted, but I think probably 80% of the people in the room are introverts too. I feel like this tension of, like going back to the potato shack thing again, right? Like, if I went to Potato Shack and it was so amazing, I would be like very, very inclined to just share that with people in my life, right? But I think all of us deeply value who the Lord is in our lives, and yet there's this great trepidation to speak openly with that.
You mean it's easier to talk about bacon and eggs than Jesus?
Yeah, like 1,000 times easier. Yeah. And so I just I'm internally wrestling with the fact that if Jesus really is who I believe he is, which he is, praise God, what's going on there? Like, and maybe it's maybe it's the fact that we live in like a culture where there's people who believe lots of different things, and we're not supposed to talk about controversial things. But can you just speak into that a little bit?
Yeah, I've got a great story with it. So my nephew Addison, he'll be 13 in October, is on the autism spectrum, like pretty significantly, and he's unbelievable. A couple of years ago, for Christmas, my wife and I got him the anthology of Calvin and Hobbes. I mean, so Addison loves animated things. He loves reading and loves animals. So it's like Calvin and Hobbes anthology. This is going to be like the greatest thing in the world, right? He's just going to be through the moon getting this. He opens it up and would just kind of set it aside. Like he didn't even say thank you. He didn't even know what it was, right? And a little bit to that is we have to be very conscious of the mode of the receiver, right? Is that, yeah, it's really easy for me to talk about bacon and eggs with Joe Schmo on the street, you know, because they're open to the idea of a nice restaurant kind of thing. The problem is within our society is that a lot of people are closed to the gospel, right? When I share that piece about the Potato Shack, I think we need to have the missionary impulse and thrust and energy to preach the gospel, but not necessarily like pull out signs and shout at people, you know what I mean, and hit over the head with the gospel. Right? It's more so the internal gusto, right, or internal energy of the gospel, but we also have to be very conscious of the person and what it is they're able to receive, right? People need different things at different times, right? And that's great. Where you're at is where you're at, and where you're at is okay. But what can we do to invite them to the next place, right? Just because you encounter Jesus doesn't mean that the next person that you see, you're like, I can't wait to tell you about, right, you know, that kind of thing. But it could be being, again, kind of more interested in their questions, right? And almost like what I would call is kind of the art of leading people to Christ, right? Again, it's kind of this movement to communion. And it's not in like a manipulative sort of way, but it's, if I'm a beggar showing up there beggar where the food is, I have to come with some intentionality in being able to invite that beggar to where the food is, right? And I have to be conscious of what is it that they're really desiring, what is it that they're really seeking, and I do that through inquiry, you know, I do that through asking good questions, through knowing about them and their life, and perhaps what their next step might be, right? And discerning what their next step might be. You know, is a good, perhaps a recent example from my life. My brother-in-law, really intellectual guy, he converted to the Catholic faith when he got married, but not because he was really bought in, but because he really liked my sister-in-law. I would say, and just in conversations with him, I can kind of make that judgment. Yeah, anyway. So really intellectually, he's really into this psychologist, Jordan Peterson. Have you all heard about Jordan Peterson? Really fascinating. So Jordan Peterson, he's a psychologist from Canada that is making a lot of waves within just the secular world right now, speaking about things like responsibility and lots of different pieces. He's a little bit controversial because of some things he says, but he's really into Jordan Peterson, my brother-in-law Tony. And so the other day, I saw that Bishop Barron, through Word on Fire, put out this new book. It's called Jordan Peterson, God and Christianity. And I was like, wow, interesting. So I sent it to him. He already got the book. He ordered it right away. He was really interested in it, right? Because Jordan Peterson kind of like opens up the idea of belief in God, but from a psychological perspective. Really fascinating stuff. Anyway, but that was just a little bit, if I would have invited him to like a big praise and worship night, or like even to mass or something, like it would have been too much for him. But that was just like the nice little nugget, and it might lead to more conversation. So I don't know if that answers your question well.
No, that's really helpful. And I think just to use your analogy,
yeah, I mean, it can be, because you work for the church. Of course you're going to say the things that you're going to say. And that's where, you know, I mentioned it kind of offhand, the whole like Jesus is more interested in their questions. I really believe that that's people love talking about themselves. I don't know if you can tell, sorry. But I do think that there's an element of like asking, really thinking through ways that you can ask better and better questions with people. And it can be a really helpful way to kind of disarm a little bit. You know, one of the real kind of famous programs out right now is Alpha, if you've heard of that, right? So what Alpha I think does really well is it begins with a question, right? Is there more to life than this? It's a really great question. Have people actually wrestled with it? Like if we kind of start from that place of inquiry, I think oftentimes that can disarm people in a helpful way, you know? So it's kind of what's like the need that's being felt there, and what's the question that we kind of tap into. But you're right. I mean, sometimes it's like you're handing out paper. You're running from one thing to the next. Like that's really that challenge that oftentimes we can face, especially in parish life, is that there's logistics to take care of. There's your own kind of program to take care of. But then it's how do I build that authentic relationship with them? But maybe even going back to what we talked about before, that like kind of personal witness can sometimes build that bridge of trust. You know, like if you're talking about an area of life where you were wrestling with something, that resonates with people. I mean, I would say that even when I shared the story of my experience in high school, like my own testimony, I would venture to say that perhaps like built trust within a number of you. Right? Just the fact that I would share something really authentic and really real of an experience that I had and how Jesus met that. And so I think that's one of the best ways that, in a certain sense, we can build more and more trust with the people in our care, even if it's not sitting down for coffee. You know what I mean? That we might not be able to do in certain situations.